One, because it was deleted. And then this is the that's fine.
Hello, everybody.
I got to sit next to them.
Thanks for we're starting at the very CalArts time of about 10 minutes after. I'm Andrew Culp. I have a long list of people to thank, but I'll abbreviate it for now. Just to even make this book come into being, as you'll see with the very extended thank yous written in the book itself. Even things written in isolation require many hands to be made. And I can't think of a better place to finish it than here at CalArts with all of you. And in particular, CalArts being a place where we experiment with form while also having a really radical mission of transformation at the same time. And two people in particular I want to thank for tonight are Rosa and Mohan, who without their help, this event would be in terms of the format, it's going to be a reading, which I love. And I've learned from my creative writing colleagues that it's much more exciting than someone just reading a paper to you. So we're actually going to be joined by a variety of voices. After that, there'll be a book signing. And I also have some books that I purchased at cost that you all can get if you'd like as well. And I've also made some handmade booklets. I forgot the third in the series, and these are free and available to everyone, so there's no cost involved. I'd love to give you some booklets. And then there'll be a reception as well, where you can have a drink and enjoy, and hopefully we'll get to meet each other if you haven't met everyone here already. So one of the really excellent parts. The readers today are current and former students, but they're really people I've worked with as much as worked, or with advised. Though unfortunately, one of them can't be with us tonight. Ryan Mangione-Smith was going to be here, who wrote an amazing thesis on this show at Lace in the 80s by gay artists, provocateurs, perverts. But Ryan, his roommate came down with COVID and he's feeling a little under the weather himself. So if you know Ryan, definitely reach out to him and wish him well. And that means that C is going to be standing in for part of his part. But C was already going to be here. So we're getting a lot of C tonight, and that's great. We love that. A few notes, just a few very brief notes on the book before we continue. If you read the back, you'll already have an idea of what it is, but for me, I like to think of it as a philosophy of movement in action to really provoke the idea of a radical event. It's not meant to be a blueprint, but actually have 18 freestanding segments wrapped with an introduction and conclusion. For me, it's reminiscent of Marshall McLuhan's prose, which are meant to provoke and inspire more than to actually take you to some sort of preset conclusion. And to sort of get us there, I'll read some text that I wrote for the back matter that my press cut out that I still in love with and can't help but sort of say every time when I try and describe the book to someone. So I say, each of these 18 freestanding segments is meant to be read in the field and on the go, whether on the way to a political action or during those precious stolen moments at work. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Steve. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Really honored to be here and really so moved by this work and in a complicated way because hope in the conditions in which we live is quite painful. And you really are able to bring that to life for me. So thank you. And I am going to go on for a while. Just know that I'm supposed to be like two different people. You're supposed to have like a variety of voice. Okay.
Aren't we all?
At least. This is the introduction to the criminality section. Straight society is held together by lines. Sovereign among them are the straight lines of filiation harkening back to monarchic bloodlines. They are mixed now with the molecular lines of the nuclear biofamily. These are joined by legal lines of the nationalist state, which treat citizens like an extended family. And with the advent of a digital reticular society, the lines do not disappear. They simply proliferate as relations are flattened to connections drawing everyone and everything together into a single network. The history of queerness is the chronicle of being incompatible with these lines. And this anti-history is passed down through gossip or bawdy tales of the lives of those social enemies who contribute nothing to society. This is how queerness substitutes linear affiliation for an allegiance with the underworld. And in turn, it opens up an avenue for queerness not to refute its association with criminality, but instead to refashion it into the threats of other illegalists. The economic illegalism of machine breakers, the social illegalism of forming underground associations, the civil illegalism of rejecting marriage, and the political illegalism of rioters. The era of the homophile promotion of the harmless gay immediately ceased when the state reinforced its reactionary line against queerness in the 1960s. The evasively fluid genders and sexualities caught up in its dragnet were urgently radicalized. Its ranks included Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera of the street transvestite action revolutionaries who fought pig power as sex worker mothers through a new version of queer kinship. They found themselves backed by an intelligentsia typified in Jean Genet, who was abandoned at birth, a vagabond, male prostitute, and thief, who spent most of his youth in prison, and who called questions about the origins of his sexuality a pointless diversion. These groups flipped the last decade of Richard von Krafft-Ebing's pathologizing etiological questions, how did you end up as a homosexual? Was it dad's fault or mom's? Into political interrogations of how universal desire was forced into the straitjacket of compulsory heterosexuality. An essential contribution of queerness to the politics of the underground is the aesthetic sensibility of opacity. Most practically, it is a rejection of the liberal pact of the closet, which promises liberation in exchange for confessional declarations of gender or sexual orientation. Conceptually, it is bolstered by the queer refusal of interiority, which dismisses the self or its past as some hidden well of truth waiting to be discovered through the work of introspection, as the etiological approach has long demanded. Do not ask who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same, Michel Foucault once wrote. Leave it to our bureaucrats and our police to see that our papers are in order. Echoing Foucault's willfully criminal desire for opacity, queers need not draw lines between good gays and perverts, the abstinent and junkies, discreet lesbians from butches, and dysphorics from gender terrorists. Groups like the Homosexual Revolutionary Action Front revolted against the goal of winning legal protections and social recognition through a well-cultivated identity. They advanced sexuality not as a revolutionary motor, which is only as far as the straight left was willing to go, but as a model of resistance that called forth the term expanded homosexuality, which refused to reduce their existence to one more identity living peacefully alongside others, the homosexual, or to limit their struggle to sexuality as one isolatable dimension of the social. Their sexuality is, rather, the disruption of the whole political field through relation. Going back at least as far as colonialism, the demand for transparency has served as the bottom of the mirror in which Western humanity reflected the world in its image. Within this framework, The modern criminalization of queers' every gesture, statement, expression, and opinion has become a screen upon which straights project their fantasies. From the police officer looking for an excuse to rough someone up to a colleague looking to sink their hooks into you. Opacity may have started as a survival strategy, but it quickly morphed into a masked game of concealment, subtext, and working undercover. As Foucault does by substituting the law with war, opacity's tactics exchange the standpoint-neutral promises of universal transparency for a partisan strategy of disclosure that follows Sun Tzu's maxim that all warfare is based on deception. The conflict has only accelerated under surveillance, as quantitative researchers knit together sexuality, race, and criminality through cybernetic means. 2 decades after Homosexual Revolutionary Action Front, Leo Bersani would echo their concerns by writing that never before have gay men and women been so visible. Its result? The social project inherent in the 19th century invention of the homosexual can perhaps now be realized. Visibility as a precondition of surveillance, disciplinary intervention, and at the limit, gender cleansing. Though queers have held a suspicion of identities as found in the distrust of scientific motives, an eye to the exclusionary effects of identity, a mistrust in any internal essence of sexuality, and a hyper-awareness of the constructed nature of subjects, all of these efforts, while valuable, have largely had an assimilative rather than subversive effect. Such assimilation can be seen in those who abandon visions of revolution, resigning themselves to the narrow political ambitions of the micropolitics of local struggles for participatory democracy and social justice. Bersani's proposal is not to a return to the immobilizing definition of identity, nor even resistance to normalizing methodologies, but instead to think of homosexuality as truly disruptive, as a force, one force in particular, a revolutionary inaptitude for sociality. Its mandate is not the liberal pluralist tolerance for a diverse lifestyle, but rather the politically unacceptable and politically indispensable choice of an outlaw existence. Whereas Queer Nation declared in the 1980s that we are everywhere, the new millennium brought about the criminal queers of Dash Back, who turned their backs on winning respectability through visibility. In response to being queer bashed, they bashed back through bar fights, outrunning lynch mobs, glamdalization, attacking the homes of heterosexist murderers, outright chaos, alleged lootings, theory discussions, self-defense tips, social gatherings, beatdowns, the acquisition of large quantities of pepper spray, and attempts at sexual liberation. It is in these gender outlaws that queerness and criminality have always coincided. Their classrooms are found in the walk from the flop pad to the scene of an incident. The first day of their history courses open with "Stonewall was a riot." Their survey textbook, "What is Gender Nihilism? A Reader," is made to be encountered adrift in the world, in coffee shops and libraries, riding on buses, and snuck into schools. And the editors of their flagship journal, Voidan, Journal of Queer Nihilism, of Queer Heresy, of Queer Time Travel, declare that a non-identitarian, unrepresentable, unintelligible queer revolt will be purely negative, or it won't be at all, as identity politics, platforms, formal organizations, subcultures, activist campaigns, each being either queer or anarchist, will always arrive at the dead ends of identity and representation. That was one part. Can I read part of chapter 8 instead of chapter 10? That is my desire. It took me to, this moment of talking about visibility, connectivity, kind of tech, altruistic connectivity premises that are put out there. And then Yeah, I'm jumping into chapter 8, which is excitement and exposure. Absent from these accounts is the sexual double meaning of liberal ideas of access, free expression, and transparency, a result of the God trick discussed by Donna Haraway of seeing everything from nowhere. Its key mechanism is the elimination of the body of knowledge from which the information is derived. What comes into view when we return the body? Whole economies of visibility that use bodies as narrative commodities that have been used to feed the last century's proliferation of cinema, television, and video. For Judith Butler, as a Lacanian invested in the dialectic of recognition, this is the essence of the political. Not only must the body appear for politics to occur, she argues, but the exposure of the flesh to the gaze, touch, possession, and violence of others. It is through the body that gender and sexuality become exposed to others, implicated in social processes, inscribed by cultural norms, and apprehended in their social meanings. Such a formulation remains trapped in a paradox of exposure, in which making something visible renders it a potential object of harm. Its latest iteration is found in popular feminism, whose politics of visibility for its own sake has been structurally matched by popular misogyny. On one side, there is liberal feminism's full spectrum courting of the dialectic of recognition, and on the other, the libertarianism of #gamergaters, incels, and pickup artists, who all loudly demand greater transparency. With the latter comes a howling insistence on access to certain bodies, the entitled expectation that any sexual expression is available for the right pay, and an ardent defense of the right for ever more penetrating forms of exposure. How does radical feminism fit in this context? Haraway poses the problematic this way. What is more powerful, the eco-goddess or the cyborg feminist? The eco-feminist response is obvious. It would amplify the already existing natural resistances of the body. Anxiety, panic, and exhaustion all seem like natural responses to unparalleled levels of exposure and states of constant excitation. Moreover, sleep wages a passive war against digital capitalism's attempt to turn every second into a productive moment. In sleep, the body finds temporary disengagement from various excitation frustration cycles induced by technologies of the body, biotechnologies, surgery, pharmaceuticals, and representation, film, television, digital media. It even contains a feminist dimension as a moment when we abandon ourselves to the care of others. Explaining another natural resistance to the pornographic gaze, porn actress Nina Roberts explains that some of her colleagues fatten up to a high degree when they stop making films to avoid being recognized and to desexualize themselves, so they can go out and do their shopping without being taken for sluts in heat looking for hard cocks. I really wanted to say that sentence in this room. Considering a way to use secrecy as a weapon rather than a retreat, Preciado advances an alternative. Would it be easier for them to take chemically synthesized testosterone to transition genders? That way, this is a quote, they could transform themselves into courteous and anonymous customers with hairy arms and low voices. This follows from Paul Preciado's own high-speed study as a feminist hooked on testosterone, testo junkie, self-documenting non-medical experiments with hormone gel meant to operate as a manual of gender bioterrorism undertaken on a molecular level. It leans into the cyber-feminist argument that gendered bodies have long been central to technology, whether as typists, telephone operators, the first coders, or other laboring subjects. Forcing them to choose between themselves and technology would then be asking them to take away part of their history. Instead of finding shelter from the most destructive tendencies of medicalized capitalism, technological militarism, and other social processes, the cyborg expands them to the point of revolutionary transformation. There is nothing more punk rock than the politics of fucking the system. No doubt it took a queer like Lee Edelman to make good on the punk rallying cry, "No future." Its nose-thumbing politics is not found in the drug-fueled excesses of sellout musicians, but the punk of those who make their lives through squatting, petty theft, dumpster diving, paid medical experiments, and donating plasma. With it comes a strong dose of pugilistic refusal and a mantra to not care about living past 25. Yet, for all its bluster, a punk lifestyle does not evade cycles of frustration, excitation, and demands for exposure. Rather, punk engages in an art of distances and involves a hyper self-exploitative submission to a certain sliver of extreme indignities in exchange for freedom from the rest. The spirit is crystallized in the first written lines in Bernadette Corporation's all too cool film, Get Rid of Yourself. So this is a long quote. They say another world is possible, but I am another world. Am I possible? I'm here, living, stealing, doing cocaine, subtracting myself from the bad movie of urban love stories, inventing weapons, elaborating the complex constellation of my relations, building the party. They say another world is possible, but we do not want another world, another order, another justice, another logical nightmare. We do not want any global governments, be it fair, be it ecological, be it certified by Porto Alegre. We want this world. We want this world as chaos. We want the chaos of our lives, the chaos of our perceptions, the chaos of our desires and repulsions, the chaos that happens when management collapses. Capitalism defeated traditional societies because it was more exciting than they were. But now there is something more exciting than capitalism itself, its destruction, close quote. For Preciado, this means a deep commitment to queer pornographic self-exposure and the presumed license to fuck with everyone else. Sexuality seems to offer the perfect lever for upsetting all of the other biopolitical dimensions of contemporary control, yet it is easy to take it too far, especially with someone with as much swagger as Preciado. I'm so glad you continued here. Being careless and wielding the self to describe more serious plights is a potential pitfall for the auto theory of Preciado and others, notes Crispin Long. Long locates a number of episodes in Preciado's self-centered writing, though the critique also smacks of liberal self-flagellation about how much worse others have it. For instance, Long is concerned with Preciado using his own border crossings, such as physical inspections by agents of the law, as an occasion to theorize about the challenges for migrants and refugees, especially trans and gender nonconforming ones. There is much to unpack in a second instance in which Preciado experiments with the name Marcos as a new masculine first name by deprivatizing the nom de guerre of the Zapatista spokesperson, calling him actually a drag king in the process. Latin American activists immediately denounced this as a colonial land grab. Preciado is a white Spaniard, and an inappropriate comparison to the struggles of indigenous people against the settler state, something Preciado cops to in his introduction, yet still saw fit to include the essay, although he chose not to adopt the name. And a third occasion occurs when Preciado briefly wanders the streets of New York in search of his soul through the technological landscape of always-on digital devices and drone surveillance. Without it, he declares himself half dead and half alive, an unlikely cross between Freddie Gray and Caitlyn Jenner. The latter comparison is apt, as Preciado condemns how one of Jenner's televised interviews demonstrated how any TV studio, living room, computer, or smartphone can become an operating theater where a sex reassignment process is taking place. For all of its incisive reflection on others, Preciado's half-dead embodiment of Freddie Gray is never examined. Gray is tossed away like a loose cigarette, a single disposable thing separated from its pack and thoughtlessly used up in a rush of excitement, then rubbed into the pavement without another thought. None of this dismisses the importance of Preciado's essential diagnosis of today's porno power. Rather, his failure comes from his inability to heed Foucault's gesture of refusal to get free of oneself. Nowhere is this more evident than Preciado's political porno-punk tactic of self-exploitation, or in the words of Testo Junkie, the auto-guinea pig tradition of scientists first testing chemicals and treatments on themselves. To be clear, this is not some demand for Preciado to ritualistically repeat one of liberalism's many hand-wringing apologies. Those pre-written performatives always fail because they ensnare the privileged in endless self-analysis at the expense of the risky politics of taking sides in a struggle. Also note how self-reflexivity loops back to the cybernetic anthropology of Margaret Mead. Instead, it means preventing the self from being installed at the center of the universe, or even a planet like Uranus. Else it will but suck everything into its gravitational pull. Does this not explain Preciado's confinement to digital devices, absolutely transfixed by the pornographic exposure of the camera, logging chemical sexual encounters in incredible detail from preparation to execution, the prisoner's timetable at the beginning of Discipline and Punish? As Gilles Deleuze warns, there is nothing worse than finding yourself trapped in the other's electrifying gaze. As a tea junkie, what Preciado adds is the self-absorbed chemical jolt of testosterone gel with a fixation on the resulting subjective shift. In the end, the self-indulgence of Testo Junkie remains too singular, which is to say, not abstract enough to generalize to the underground. So, yes, let's fuck the system, but in a way that builds opacity for others to operate, rather than selfish notoriety. And this one more short chapter, it's chapter 9. It's a heart that burns and burns. I don't want these things to happen, they just do, murmurs Rita, a character in Joyce Carol Oates' Foxfire. A tragic girl, Rita could not help that terrible things always seemed to happen to her. Her brothers and other boys exploited her. The abuse would begin with teasing and sometimes ended in worse. To speak of a milder incident, one time when she was 7, her brothers yanked off her panties and hoisted them in a high tree for the cruel satisfaction of the neighborhood boys. Every time she apologized in a detached and matter-of-fact way, as if each injustice happened around but not to her, like the weather, totally absent of anything about her, her body, her status as female. One day, it all changes. Rita and 3 other high school girls cram in a small room on New Year's Eve day, 1953. Led by Legs, first in command, they form a blood sisterhood, a girl gang. Foxfire is your heart. Foxfire quickly develops a taste for revenge. They feast on the joy and pleasure that follows from breaking through the shame and disdain of long submitting to absent and alcoholic fathers, lecherous teachers and uncles, and ruthless boys and brothers. Separately, the girls felt suffocated, but together they are delirious with life. Foxfire's bond is underwritten by love, even if it is fueled by vengeance. When others would feel regret or remorse or guilt and sin, they simply scream, "Foxfire burns and burns," and "Foxfire never says sorry." And the way they tell it, there is no reason for you to feel sorry either. As Maddie writes of their notebooks, Foxfire's actions are, no doubt, crimes. Yet, most of these went not only unpunished, but unacknowledged. Our victims, all male, were too ashamed or too cowardly to come forward to complain. It is not the crime that defines them, however. It just adds to their strength. Simply being together, even before undertaking their campaign of justice, the girls began their migration from forgettable girls to figures of history. Foxfire was already on everyone's lips. Their mere presence bred curiosity and suspicion, but they truly command respect once they begin striking against the men who left them hurt, alone, or vulnerable. And it is this respect that allows the girls to finally embrace the distrust for adults and boys they had long privately nursed. There is much to say about the history of Foxfire. Tales of youthful exuberance or irresponsibility that led them astray. explanations of how Foxfire Homestead and Foxfire Finances sealed their sad fate. But these distract from Foxfire's agonizing truth. The path of liberation and escape winds through negative affects and not around them. For revenge can serve as the greatest act of love.
Can I take my mask off? I don't project my voice as much. It has been a joy to be your TA in radical politics. We had a great class this morning. I was trying to start a mosh pit, but Will wasn't following suit, unfortunately. I'm going to read from chapter 14, Self-Abolition, which is part of the third section on fugitivity. Self-abolition. How might one draw the lines of lineage behind the 2015 Baltimore uprising at Teen Epistolary, as seen become book ripped straight from the internet? Does it not partake in the same sort of ultra-white social infrastructure that underwrote white conceptualist Kenneth Goldsmith's public reading of Michael Brown's autopsy as poetry? Does it redact documents like the American FBI and CIA did, whitewashing history by erasing people a second time, even after they were targeted and killed? Or does it partake in a different form of racial appropriation, like that of Emner Bessie Phillips' Song and Claudia Rankine's Citizen, the former grappling with the fact that Africans were barred from being named in a legal text, forever trapped below, the latter struggling to dedicate pieces in memoriam, with the full knowledge that it will continue to go on and on, dissolving to white. Considering broader questions about the nature of Twitter as a medium, one might ask whether, perhaps, the genealogy of Twitter from protest tool to corporate platform reveals something significant about its operations. For instance, what happens when a fugitive tool for evading capture is made prosecutorial, replacing movement with the furnishing of evidence? Does the shift in registers contaminate the activist dream of freedom through recourse to the force of law inherent to Twitter? Is this why Twitter has served as such a hospitable environment for harassment, dragging, and call-out? And how do these captive functions echo the anti-Black violence at the heart of the policing? Formal aesthetic considerations of uprising expand on its fugitive form. Its authors, for instance, appears as fugitive. They appear underground, on the margins, or not at all, much like the subject of Devin Allen's famous Time magazine cover, a masked man chased by a mass of riot police, wielding bludgeons, with the headline, America, 1968 crossed out, 2015, what has changed, what hasn't? Like the event itself, neither the cover nor the contents of Uprising reveals a name, only that of the already dead, Freddie Gray. A familiar approach to determining its purpose would be to identify its author, but its cover reveals none. A few details emerge after some strategic searching online, all of which track back to a project titled Research and Destroy New York City. The project's webpage includes a series of anti-cop materials bearing the punk rock anarchist aesthetics that adorn a mixture of creative and research-based publications. From Cops Hate Cops to a brief history of the 23rd Precinct for the 45th anniversary of the East Harlem riots and rebellion. None bear a name. Their inspiration is likely a mix of those mid-century intellectuals who proclaimed that to bear a name is to already be marked for death, and practical concerns over the extreme risk of being associated with written work that targets the police. Quote, I am no doubt not the only one who writes in order to have no face, Michel Foucault wrote. Do not ask me who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same. Leave it to our bureaucrats and our police to see that our papers are in order. But there are also hints of the social death behind the process of making a person into a slave, which includes the disruption of meaningful kinship, the stripping of social status through generalized dishonor and gratuitous violence for its own sake. And I'm jumping to the very end. Uprising's form proves to be part of its fugitivity. What began as a series of tweets became the physical form of a zine and then a book, which has still not been made into an ebook or easily circulated PDF. By removing the tweets from circulation, it withdraws them from the whole circulatory economy of adjudication that fuels the online outrage machine. This attests to a political power that only grows with distance, connecting it to other circuits of struggle. It does not yearn for the transparency or universality that have historically been used to extend captivity, but for freedom. The novelty of uprising, then, is its creative act of moving the conversation offline. The book transmuted the database into the codex, taking the scrolling mosaic of a digital feed and transforming it into the pages of a printed book. This is not to say that the struggle no longer circulates, but its participants can no longer be grabbed one at a time. Each entry seems to make sense only as part of a whole, its form resisting the captive isolation of grabbing a tweet in a single snapshot. The event is enveloped in the synoptic whole of a bound volume. At its most insistent, uprising transforms from documentary into kindling for sparking the event of revolt. That moment when rules no longer apply, when the problem of what is allowed ceases to be important, and the question of freedom becomes an issue of force. It is a refrain echoed in a text sent to the anarchist journal Hostess, a journal of negation, whose name is a call to be dangerous in a time when antagonism has dissipated. As editors of its third issue, dedicated to the topic of the slogan, "Fuck the Police," we received the following poem that issues threats instead of begging for permission, which is to say, it insists on unconditional abolition. It was submitted with the following note. What up, Hostess? This is a thing I made while watching the Facebook Live of the first night of rioting in Charlotte, North Carolina, and reading the unfortunate comments. I guess the intention behind it is to create space for anti-cop, Afro-pessimist leaning conversation among Black people who aren't necessarily anarchist or Afro-pessimist or whatever. If y'all are into it, don't put a name on it, just use it, I guess. Redacted. Black skin, black masks. I'm writing to you because I love you and I want you to be free. We don't need them. When we try to fit into their shit, we fill ourselves with passion. It's better to flip the table than to smile and drink more poison. The first cops in America were slave catchers. They aren't corrupt when they kill us. They're doing their job. Confront them to defeat them, not to change them. Be careful in the street. Have a friend around you to watch your back. Tell peeps to watch out, not to chill. Not everyone is trying to protest. Some people on the warpath. They right to be mad. If you won't join them, stay out their way. No justice, no peace. It's a threat. Don't say it if you don't mean it. The poison is still hurting you. If you're upset that they call us animals, criminals, savages, we might have to burn this shit to the ground.
It's been a pleasure working with Andrew this semester. To do some more of that in the future. We'll be reading from the chapter titled Politics of Asymmetry and jump around a bit. The illusion that there is only one possible world is a lie perpetuated in the metropolis to maintain a perpetual present. To put it suggestively but crudely, instead of promoting convergence culture that puts everything into communication, exclusive disjunction seeks a divergence culture that spins things off to pursue their own paths. There are already instances of this divergence, as seen in various subcultures of glitch and noise, but they do not politicize incompatibility. It is thus post-colonialism that should be our guide, as it has already politicized incommensurable, and that its blueprint for global delinking may provide clues for how separation can be won in the cybernetic web of the metropolis. Contingency. The strategic principles of guerrilla theory can thus be resurrected to guide anonymous forces in the struggle against the digital culture of the metropolis, even if guerrilla warfare cannot. In the metropolis, anonymity is not just a force of subversion. In fact, cybernetic capitalism realizes itself as an anonymous force. It is this anonymity that is the target. Television viewers, car drivers, the psychological conditioning of young students, advertising, which disperses the state into a diffuse empire that cannot be combated as an openly fascist enemy, but as a system in the metropole that reproduces itself through an ongoing offensive against people's psyche. It would be wrong to imagine cybernetic capitalism's offensive as dehumanizing. Rather, it is non-human. From the algorithms governing Wall Street financial transactions to the Obama campaign's voter prediction models, material objects are interpreted like information on the internet. Inhuman movements recorded in a myriad of different locations, log files, server statistics, email boxes, treated as the clustering of descriptive information around a specific user and devoid of a real identity. Once fully rendered within this new strategic environment, cultural politics then becomes a struggle over information's theory concept of communication as the accurate reproduction of an encoded signal across a media channel, which reintroduces the question of materiality. It was with respect to materiality that the guerrilla first found its strategic advantage, and so it is here that the guerrilla's three advantages reappear in terms of media effects. The accidents and coincidences of contingency plague the digital as bugs and glitches, which easily turn into errors and exploits. Density creates mobility and flexibility within the digital oversaturation, where spam and big data make overload possible. And the clutter of the metropolis that provides the cover of camouflage is found in the opposition of signal and noise information theory, which both covers up and disrupts distortion and loss. Just as the guerrilla makes use of contingency, the glitch introduces accidents into the metropolis. These transitory events are irritating nuisances, but common enough that they are routinely ignored, for glitches are still a deviation from the predetermined outcome, in short, an error. For developers, chasing glitches is motivated by the desire to clear the bugs out of the system, but for others, the glitch signals the potential for an exploit. In general, an exploit replicates the guerrilla strategy of turning something to one's own advantage. When culture takes on characteristics of the digital, then social or economic glitches can hint at exploits that exist as a resonant flaw designed to resist, threaten, and ultimately desert the dominant political diagram. While culture has a different architecture from that of a computer, exploits are holes generated by the hypercomplexity of any technical system that makes such systems vulnerable to penetration and change. The search for new antagonisms in the digital life of the metropolis must then begin with tracking down glitches and other traces of exploits. Density. The struggle continues with the hunt for a new terrain of struggle. If it is density that allows the guerrilla to maintain the dance of concentration and dispersion, oversaturation serves a similar function in the metropolis. The residents of the metropolis thus live in an environment with a high degree of exposure, but every data gathering process suffers from overaccumulation. The speed by which empire poses the limits of the metropolis is matched only by the swiftness in which it overcomes them, then its accelerating integration of information is both its greatest strength and a potential weakness. The metropolis is thus most exposed to choreography crafted to manipulate its openness and speed to create temporary escape routes. In contrast to the guerrilla, the overloaded metropolis leaks time more than space. And it is conceivable that temporary misapprehension and incomprehensibility could be used for the same strategic purposes as in its guerrilla form, lessening the reactionary forces of the enemy and expropriating their resources. Clutter. The unavoidable noise of digital culture provides the camouflage for operation. Noise should not then be understood as always detrimental to a system, for even if it destroys and horrifies, it is also true that order and flat repetition are in the vicinity of death. Rather, noise holds any system open to its outside and nourishes a new order. This is because background noise forms the ground of our perception. In fact, a certain degree of noise may even aid transmission. Even if the introduction of noise improves signal compression, it does so by sacrificing fidelity for mobility and flexibility. And it is here that the strategic role of noise emerges, as it engenders an indiscernibility like that of the urban guerrilla and the people, but a more fundamental one. For noise is the very material through which information travels. On a deeper level, however, strategic manipulation of noise allows for the creation of vacuoles of non-communication, opening up tiny breaches that allow one to evade control, at least temporarily. Noise also marks a destabilizing moment in a system that has a chance to widen the space of non-communication by invading a channel with the desubjectified force of the outside. The oversaturated streets of the metropolis seem to announce that we do not lack communication, but on the contrary, we have too much of it. And in fact, what we lack is creation, or really resistance to the present. If that is the case, then neither the politics of persuasion nor the presentation of facts will do, for the metropolis will remain unfazed as long as tactical media leans on the force of truth. Rather, in the struggle against it, the only mode of communication appropriate to the task is one that disrupts proper communication. A mode whose signal is one of ungovernability, insinuation. Though its effects are not clear, it is obvious that insinuation unlocks an underground force through an invisibility and an anonymity that subverts identification and legibility while distorting signals and overloading the system. Insinuation has barely converged with the dangerous politics of those who desire non-existence and disappearance. Those who have no demands, refuse political representation, and rebuke negotiation with the present. In the battles of appearances that consume the metropolis, the two promise to make a potent combination. Perhaps they will be the fusion of force and truth that will defeat cybernetic capitalism, injecting insinuations while fighting cultural politics in digital code, releasing a cascade of affect charges while turning glitches into exploits and overaccumulation into overload, and flooding the metropolis with the noisy force of the outside.
Hello.
Right.
Andrew, thank you. I'm really excited to get through this a few times, but I'm going to read chapter 17, which is called Blackout. The bright white exposure of dash cams, body cameras, CCTV, and other surveillance images have unleashed a flood of machine-generated images of police killings of Black people. They share in photography's assumed neutral work as evidence, said to exist in how it putatively authenticates the existence of a certain being. But what kind of being? Perhaps, as Calvin L. Warren argues, the world is constituted by a non-relation between Blackness and being. In the very writing of Being, he masks Black being by striking it through, by striking being through, suspending being, by putting it under erasure, using both a subtraction and an addition that makes present what is absent. For him, Black nihilism discloses how the anti-Black world abuses the functionality of Blackness without affording it the privileges of being, incarnating Black being in terrifying, vast nothingness. In between pieces dedicated to Trayvon Martin and James Craig Anderson in her book Citizen, Claudia Rankine reproduces a grayscale image of a lynching. But the Black body is missing. It has become a void, indistinct from the Black night. All that remains in the photograph is a group of boisterous whites. The subjects in the foreground make faces at the camera. The new focal point is a man pointing toward the tree with a smug satisfaction. One woman wears a wry grin. A man to the side almost seems to be posing for a portrait. Behind a bashful couple holding hands, an excited girl lets out a yelp. This is how the libidinal economy of whiteness comes into the foreground. But what about the infrastructure of whiteness? Can something even more inhuman be revealed when all bodies leave the frame? Perhaps it begins with the redaction of 3 infamous images, expanding on the readings performed by Nicholas Mirzoff. The first, a still from the suppressed October 2014 video of Officer Jason Van Dyke shooting teenager Laquan McDonald in Chicago. The second, from the July 2015 dash cam of State Trooper Brian Encinia's traffic stop of Sandra Bland in Prairie View, Texas, that would lead to her incarceration and death. The third, a grab from the December 2015 video of a mass of jailhouse officials in Chicago brutalizing Philip Coleman, who later died. Their offenses, acting erratic, refusing to put out a cigarette, being combative, and spitting blood, all result in a similar response: overkill. A white-hot violence so excessive as to try to push the Black body beyond death, past asserting inferiority to establishing the fact of non-existence. The repeated shots of a service weapon over and over again, 16 times until the clip is empty, incessant tasering by over half a dozen officers who crowd together into a jail cell to overpower a Black man in handcuffs, then drag his limp body around the halls, resulting in over 50 bruises and abrasions, a rough ride beating by police in the back of their wagon so vicious as to sever the spinal cord, circulating depictions of this violence and their effects on Black non-life, risk peddling in the same sensationalization that secures its spectacular power. What does it mean to circulate these images as an attempt to influence the world? What is the white social infrastructure in which images of Black death are treated as objects to be exchanged? Is the politics of visibility nothing more than a performance of and for whiteness? The problem further multiplies when non-Black radicals look for ways to join the struggle. These questions motivate Alexandra Juhas to ask, as an anti-racist white scholar, how do I not look? Or in contrast, Black scholar Sherry Williams has asked how she can care for her mental and emotional health as a Black woman and continue to consume images of Black death. What would we see when the spectacle of death is erased from them? What do we see when the spectacular violence that organizes the scene is cropped? What comes into focus when our eyes are no longer drawn to the void of Black non-existence? What other forms of power take over the frame when the obvious subjects of violence recede? The first capture, Chicago, in October 2014, is a street at night by dash cam. The sanitizing glare of street and security lights frame the scene. A long stretch of sidewalk cuts across the frame to establish the foreground. The presence of city services is felt. Everything is amply lit. A sign seems to indicate parking rules, and a pole advertises a bus stop. The background is obscured by a temporary fence. Close to its center, a large sign advertises a coming real estate development. Pessimistic long grass suggests that the fence has been there for a while. That promised construction may never materialize. The bright geometric shape of a digital artifact floats at the top of the frame, its significance arcane. Summarizing its features, a purely infrastructural space, its horizon to elsewhere literally foreclosed by capitalism, its bleak emptiness signifying abandonment, nothing visibly alive under the hard glare of security lights. The second capture, Prairie View, 2015, is a daylight country highway by dashcam. Its resolution is limited to blotchy colors and large shapes, reminiscent of the artificial intelligence pattern recognition of machine vision. The street stretches from side to side, appearing almost sick in its washed out yellow. The frame is pierced by a silver sky tinted by a haze that seems to eradicate everything below. The light catches a few ambiguous gray objects, power lines, some sort of sign, a short, squat fence. A run of bushy tree hems in the street, concealing and containing. A group of them cast a deep shadow over the foreground. Under it, a modest silver car hugs the curb as if unable to escape its dark clutches. The only interruption is a small patch of rolling green grass. There, though there are none, it feels that the type of building that would appear would be a pocked barn or something with weathered vinyl siding, aged enough to be ambiguously unoccupied. Desolate, the scene shows the type of place where anything could happen. Why? Because in these places, the rules are simultaneously weaker and stronger, depending on who claims to exercise them. The third capture, Chicago 2015, is the jail cell by CCTV. A fisheye lens leers into it from on high. The lens makes the cell's blue bars bow outwards as if bent from the enormous force of a natural disaster. A perfectly straight white rectangle appears over the bar, blocking what must be identifying information. Yet the number 13 remains clearly displayed above it, empty, made generic, with only cryptic numbers remaining. The cell's ability to transform human into mere body waiting for judgment is clear. If furniture is a metaphor for both the interior life of the mind and the interior comforts of the home, this is a space of pure hostility. A single short, narrow, floating slab juts out from the wall. With its sharp geometry and smooth surface so similar to the cement room surrounding it, the bench's only intent must be to cause pain, inspire only fitful sleep, and encourage distress. The only relief it provides is separation from the floor, where all sorts of agony and misery have collected over time. The dirt from thousands of pacing footsteps, the sour air of tears and sweat, the degradation of living with insects, the foul stench of sewage, and a million other kinds of other intentional neglect. The distorted appearance of the space is made further nauseating by the unevenness of the artificial light illuminating it. The sharp contrast of neon spotlights with deep shadows suggests it is a windowless dungeon, the sort of space where natural indications of time recede. It is under these conditions that time cruelly returns through rules, techniques, and habits that are always being amended. The lights never really turn off, but they brighten at a specific time. Locks release, opening up other spaces and other people. Meals arrive on a regular schedule. TVs turn on, except when they don't. Each of the three images opens onto a killing zone, a near endless stream of non-places, most often long stretches of poured concrete meant as all journey and no destination. Spaces where one is meant to be only passing through. They bear the characteristics of the older carceral landscape of the plantation, which transformed the wilderness through agro-capitalist principles to give tactical advantage to slaveholders and overseers, expanding prairies, fields, and other clearings to establish a hypervisibility trained on Black bodies. This landscape remains, having been paved only to be made into a narrowed sidewalk or an expansive road. Former country highways, now indefinitely suburban, the formerly gilded suburbs of white flight, transitioning into something else with concrete veins, opening up into terrain without clear futures, marking it distinctively public or private. Its vague features invite occupants to use it as the perfect shortcut, but with a space whose purpose is so hazy, the paranoid pathologies of whiteness and its attendant violence are often left to run wild. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for inviting me. I'm Jessica Wawra. I graduated from the Aesthetics and Politics program, and I'm reading chapter 18, Trapped Between Withdrawal and Hypervisibility. I heard that ringing a little bit.
Yeah, it's there.
I'll back it up a little. If it starts doing that, just let me know. So I'm going to start with the introduction. In their study of how the white ethics of social responsibility contributes to the violence of police profiling, Steve Martineau and Jared Sexton argue that, quote, to focus on the spectacular event of police violence is to deploy and thereby reaffirm the logic of police profiling itself, end quote. Consider then the beginning of Scenes of Subjection, where Sadia Hartman notes her refusal to recount Frederick Douglass's description of the beating of his Aunt Hester, quote, to call attention to the ease with which such scenes are usually reiterated, the casualness with which they are circulated, and the consequence of this routine display of the slave's ravaged body, end quote. She goes on to explain that the empathic identification meant to be elicited by such scenes, quote, cannot be extricated from the economy of chattel slavery, end quote, because they treat the slave's fungible, commodified body as an empty vessel, quote, to don, occupy, or possess blackness, or the black body as a sentimental resource and or locus of enjoyment, end quote. Similar aesthetic reiterations persist across a variety of mediums, more recently as intensified by ubiquitous access to the recording and dissemination of technologies of smartphones. Scenes of police summary executions of Black people have routinely saturated social media feeds and been played by television news networks. The ostensible aim is to combat such shootings by garnering empathy for the victims, but yet it quickly feeds into the established practice of witnessing the specularization of suffering as a commodity to be traded. This is a little bit longer of a chapter, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. Hopefully I don't misconstrue the context in any way here. The current preoccupation with positive, uplifting presence and negative, degrading absence, images is further disrupted by Simone Brown's study of the surveillance of blackness. Perhaps inclusive presence is not always advantageous. Through the term black luminosity, she demonstrates how policing techniques are the paradigmatic means for rendering blackness knowable through visibility, from 18th century lantern laws to contemporary facial recognition technologies. Defenders of cybernetic systems that use facial recognition or artificial intelligence to direct violence, such as computational predictive policing systems, will only entertain criticisms about discrimination based on bad data, such as the LAPD's using data gathered as part of its racist assault on gangs in the 1980s. Yet feeding in more black faces and more detailed information about black life does little to challenge its real purpose, which is to legitimize police violence through math washing and surveillance bureaucracy. Abolitionists like Brown instead look toward fugitive acts of escape, resistance, and the productive disruptions that happen when blackness enters the frame. Along similar lines, Anyabam Gupta Nigam has argued that Richard Dyer's History of Cinematic Lighting reveals a dominant aesthetic presupposition. Whiteness is allied with transparency, while blackness resists illumination through proximate opacity. The conflict between these two perspectives is played out on a formal level whenever the color black is considered through addition or subtraction. For the light artist using additive color, blackness is the absence of color, while for a painter using subtractive color, blackness is the combination of all colors. Photography and film long developed lighting to best depict white skin, as did products made by Kodak, often making darker features appear dull, opaque, or even lifeless. Associated lighting techniques are used in photomedia to further seal the bond between white illumination and the honesty of transparency, purity of inner fortitude, angelic divinity, radiant beauty, and moral virtue. On the other hand, one color theorist outlines the corporeal quality of the painter's colors, which are combined to synthesize blackness. In his mind, a white square on a black background will look larger than a black square on a white background, which lends whiteness a plenitude that, quote, reaches out and overflows the boundary, whereas the black contracts. The consequence for Gupta Nigam is that blackness is trapped between an ontological state of withdrawal and hypervisibility in marking. These two poles establish an aesthetic economy of blackness that restates Frantz Fanon's comment that, quote, I came into the world at the crossroads between nothingness and infinity, or for Calvin Warren, both nothing and infinity. I'm going to proceed ahead a little bit here. Against the backdrop of a spectacular violence, simultaneously withdrawn and hypervisible, the aesthetics of blackness appears almost impossible. The pornotropic process of rendering the black body as mere flesh seems to result in at least two polar outcomes. Blackness gets objectified as either an empty vessel or an indomitable vitality, either something inert that gains life only when ventriloquized through possession or traded as fungible commodity, or something endowed with an unconquerable vibrancy, euphemized as real, bold, deep, funky, raw, vivid, or loud. Going to go to the conclusion, part of the conclusion. Is that okay? The prefix non uses metaphysics as a raw material to discover the logics of real immanence therein. The generic blackness of euchromia is not a potent force, a generative substance, or a horizon. Excuse me. a little dry. But in opacity, the pointing out of the insufficiency of the whole philosophical endeavor and the failure of its categories of thought, in parentheses, history, the human, or liberation. In this framework, Blackness escapes the dialectical antagonism of the poisoned gift, a, quote, fundamental dependency, end quote, that, that paradoxically initiates and sustains our agency, because it does not seek to refuge in whiteness, representation, or lightness, reason. This is because the point of Blackness is not to reproduce the world, but to abolish it. Or to echo Sexton's own words, quote, slavery is the threshold of the political world, abolition the interminable radicalization of every radical movement. Thank you. Sorry about that. It's my first time in public in a long time.
Did great. And I don't have anything more for you all other than to invite you next door to where there will be refreshments, we can chat. I would love for people to talk and chat about the book. Not now, you don't have to, it's already had quite a bit, but into the future, send me an email, let's have some coffee. Let's make some things. I also just released a film that is actually showing as part of CalArts Expo next week in A300 called Machines in Flames.
Yes.
And as part of that project, we're asking people who screen it to often try and get the viewers to engage in some sort of creative process, because we know that the people who inspired the film would hate nothing than just seeing a room full of people like staring blankly at a screen for an hour, which is kind of what the film is. And so that's hopefully one of my dreams for this project as well, which is kind of why I started out with these handmade booklets. So even if you don't want a book, feel free to get a booklet or two if you want. And otherwise, I'll see you this whole day. And thanks for coming.
That's the last one.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, there are so many like linking.